of us, right? Um,
Okay.
so I guess
Heard.
do I do we want to get started? Yeah, we're recording, so that's good. And then
Minutes, approval of the
y-
minutes.
yeah, do we have any? I mean, I can make a motion to approve the minutes, I guess. Does anyone want a second?
I'll
Second.
second it, or third it, whichever number I came up in.
All right. Well, we have a an action-packed agenda. I'm excited to hear from, or we're excited to hear from Terrence with updates from Cura, and then also, the draft report is out, so I think we're going to talk through a big chunk of that as well. So it should be a full meeting with content, if not with members.
Awesome.
I can turn it over to Terrence. Just to kind of tee him up a little bit. He has a proposal for you all to just kind of walk through getting out applications for the table. And it'll be also seeking somebody from this committee that maybe can review those folks with him. So start thinking about if that wants to be you. Right now, obviously, if one of you is willing, that would be awesome. Otherwise, we'll follow up an email with the full committee afterwards. So take it away.
Right on. Well, thank you again. It's good to be with you all again. I feel like so much has been happening so quickly. I'm really excited to really talk about this anti-displacement work group as we're sort of really prepared to make the big call for folks to join starting next week. I'll talk a little bit more about those deadlines. I could just say there's a lot of interest in this group, which is great, right? Both from governments, from private interests, from organizations, and from just regular folks who live in the corridor. And I think the challenge, of course, with that is just trying to fit everybody's thoughts into how to form this committee. So I suspect there may be some parts that you don't love, but hopefully there are a lot of parts that you do love, and ultimately getting to a structure and a work group that leads to tangible outcomes. So let's jump into it. So, the general principles, what everybody really cares about with this group, and I just wanted to be very transparent in what I've generally heard as I've been chatting with folks, is one, the most important thing is that this group develops recommendations that can be practically implemented, right? I think folks might be used to Kira as a research entity, and of course don't want this to end with, hey, let's study something more, or we recommend that you study something more, right? Folks want to get to what are those practical investments, those specific policies that fit within the context of Minnesota and county and local law, and that will really have a tangible impact in terms of addressing displacement. And so we're really focused on not leaving this process with more studies to be done, but rather, strong recommendations that are capable and ready from the day that they're released. We want to work through existing tensions between various interests. So I talked about there's a lot of groups, right? We're talking about multiple cities, the county, the state, federal governments amidst public and private interest. And tensions, I don't mean that in a bad sort of way. Right? I just mean tensions where folks may not be using the same language when we say anti-displacement, or when you talk about a particular policy, maybe not feel the exact way, or see that it's sort of implemented in the same exact way, or just knowing that there are various groups who need to be cared for, but don't know what it, might be thinking this is a zero-sum game, and what everybody needs maybe is not possible. And so I think really what is core to this group is what we've been saying is that we want to have the conflict during the project, right? And that means, like, we don't want these folks to come together, deliver recommendations. The different governments who are sort of susceptible to receiving recommendations to say, like, hey, that sounds great, we'll talk to you later, right? We want to hear what folks have to say, and exist in those tensions and what's possible during this project, so that when the recommendations come, they're cognizant of all of those things. Three, folks are busy, right? There's a lot going on. I'm admirable of y'all who show up month after month. I admire y'all who show up month after month for these conversations, but I think that's really, really hard, and we're asking from a lot. particularly in the context of the pandemic and just everything that's going on in folks' lives. But at the same time, this is going to require us to get a really deep dive and nuanced understanding, right? If we want to get to those practical implementations to wrestle with the context of law and different interests, then we really need to get to a deep dive. And so what I'll be presenting today is really focused on developing a structure that gets to that. And then lastly, we want this structure to develop clarity on ideas while also bringing along implementers for the discussion, right? So it's not just community recommending this, but it's those who will receive those recommendations. I don't want anybody to be surprised at any moment throughout this process about what the recommendations are or the necessities behind them for them to be implemented at the highest common denominator. Thanks, Sophia. Going to the next slide. I think, yeah, so I think maybe we skipped a slide. So just to get a note on some general activities of what this group will be doing, and just really to clarify it maybe amongst other groups. The core focus on this will be to continue to advise on the research agenda and project organizing, right? So as we are sort of getting specific and as we're getting more detailed into the different qualitative and quantitative studies, this group is going to be there along for the ride, perhaps more than most folks in all the particularities to advise on that. And the big point of that is making meaning of the research findings, right? One thing that I don't want to happen, we don't want to happen, of course, as researchers, folks look at, well, as we're doing this qualitative, we're doing interviews, we're doing focus groups and communities, we're door knocking, we're doing all these things. Folks will say, well, Kira, what does this mean? I think what's really important is that community is there to make sense of our research findings and co-make meaning. And we're going to be really thinking about the way that different groups might have different frameworks or intentions or constituencies that they feel accountable to. That all become part of making meaning of research findings. Of course, we don't want to jade things or skew things, but that's a collective project that we believe exists along with this anti-displacement working group. 3, of course, the making the recommendations, right? This group will be the one that makes the recommendations. It of course doesn't mean that that course means the CAC, doesn't mean that the CAC, the BAC, and the other committees we won't be having the conversation, because obviously I'll be here talking with y'all. But they sort of have that formal responsibility as a charter of the group themselves to make the recommendations, both policy and investments for both the public and the private sectors, and for them to implement. And then 4, to participate in the engagement in the different interests on the project. One thing I want to be very clear on is I'm just talking about the anti-displacement working group. There, of course, will be a broader project of engaging in community around the same stuff. So we don't just plan on talking to the members of the anti-displacement work group, but of course, we plan for this to be public and saturated in community to the extent that there's a consent by the overall community that exists along the line. So, with that said, in the simplest possible, we're looking for 21 members. What I don't want to get overly focused on is the exact number. This is what we're pointing towards, right? It could be a little bit more. I don't want it to be too much less, but just generally looking for folks that we want on this group. Each of these different folks have a different role, and I'm going to talk about why we sort of came to this. One thing is that we don't want dispersed conversations. I mean, we're not trying to control this be the only place to have a conversation, but how to have dispersed conversations, how to have that conflict amongst different interests, how to bring along both community recommenders and the implementers along the way is more or less how we designed the membership group amongst this. So diving into it, how we're sort of thinking about having that conflict, getting to the tension, getting to that practical implementation. Of course, an important part is the cities along the way. One thing I do want to note is that we're not talking about elected officials, right? There will be no elected officials who sit in the membership. But what we are looking for are folks from who have a broad range of authority at these governments, who can showcase, or who can sort of give commentary, knowing the legal framework, a legal context that these governments exist in, the resource framework that these governments exist in, and of course have an understanding about the different layers of governments and responsibilities around any particular issue. And of course, we want someone who's not just there to say no, right? And so we're really looking for folks in government who can have a very real dialogue with the anti-displacement working group and of course the community at large about the reality and necessity of implementing or of getting to practical recommendations. And along with that, what it's not just the member that will be sitting at the group, what we're asking to happen as a structure behind the anti-displacement working group is that each of these different governments will form a group internal into the government, again, made up of staff, and maybe in that place there might be elected folks as well, who they can bring the conversation back from the anti-displacement work group into the context of the governments to provide active and real-time feedback to the group as they're discussing, in particular, recommendations, making meaning of the data, and ultimately to, for that dialogue and conflict to sort of exist amongst how to get to the practical implementation. This is important because I think what a lot of folks get sort of put like, well, see, Terrence, are they going to do what this group says? It's important to know, right, that there is no legal mandate for governments to follow these recommendations, right? I think that these governments have all been very supportive, right? They, of course, Hennepin County, the Met Council are the ones who curated this work to happen in the first place, curated with Kira. But what gives us the best possibility then for these governments to see the importance of the recommendations, to give nuanced feedback back to this group, and then ultimately to have some be able to identify with transparency and accountability who's going to carry those recommendations for actual implementation when the recommendations come, right? And so the really important role that these folks play is to structure recommendations back to responsible governments to get inputs, to assist the anti-displacement working group in developing achievable recommendations, right? Let's talk about the legal framework that these policies might exist in, the resource frameworks for investments and those different sort of things as well. But also to provide data and other information to the research team. That's a very timely process if we don't have that. To provide response back to anti-displacement working group recommendations in real time, and to participate in the general anti-displacement working group activities in general. So that's what we're thinking for government representatives. For affiliated community members, and once again, I don't want to get overly focused on the numbers here, but just generally we want to see a good representation of business or business-centered organizations and nonprofits as well. I know I'm thinking of you, Ms. Fleming, because I know I remember in our initial conversation, you're like, no people from organizations, right? and so I hear that, and I just want to know I recognize that, and I know this is contrary to your recommendation. I think the reason why we went this direction again was there are dispersed conversations that are happening in community. So how do we build sort of a sense of trust in these recommendations? I think it's similar to governments. We need to have those folks at the table to not be talking and back channeling in other different places, but to find a common space amongst these different interested parties. Of course, important, I think these organizations and the people do not need to live in this corridor or have a representative interest in the corridor as well. So we're looking for folks who housing or anti-displacement centered organizations, small businesses owned and operated particularly by folks of color that have been around for a while and are struggling to stay open. The important point is that we're trying to find folks who are experiencing the vulnerability of displacement. And again, an important aspect of it is that this opens up a broader communication channel within community as well, right? There are folks who come to organizations to know what to think about the blue line or what's happening in the blue line. So I think it's best served if we sort of create that open channel in the context of this group. And so within that, the role is to structure the recommendations and interests from the organizations and partnerships back to the anti-displacement work group. We want these folks to connect research to the organizations and partnerships, constituencies, and members, right? So when we're looking for folks to participate in focus groups or interviews or to do door knocking with us, right? We're going to really have a responsibility amongst these organized folks. And then in general, to participate in general anti-displacement working group activities.
So see, Terrence, just for clarity, I mean, okay, with those type of organizations, my issue is with having the philanthropic folks a part of this group.
Oh, okay. Let me. I want to hear more about that. I'm going to jump to them in the next slide. Talk about why we're having them there, but I do want to hear a little bit more about that too. I want to hear all that you have to say about that. So just very quickly on this, so we can jump to your question. We want to have, of course, folks who are not affiliated with community representatives. We want, youth, people that have experienced displacement, people that are at risk of displacement, both renters and homeowners, and just general residents in jurisdictions along the corridor. These are folks who are not backed by organizations. They're just the common, regular folks who exist in the community, but of course have a vested interest in the outcome of this initiative. And so again, I'm not saying that people will be sort of like there'll be one youth person, one person. Like there might be folks who identify with multiple aspects of this demographic, right? Maybe it might be a youth that has experienced displacement or is at risk of displacement. So not holding it as a one-to-one thing, but we're just generally looking to get folks. I think that's important because one, I don't view, we're not going to only engage the anti-displacement working group. There'll be a broader engagement of people in the community around this, both in the context of research and also in the context of like engagement and organizing from the initiative itself. So we're not saying, hey, we're talking to one youth to tell us the experience of all youth, right? That'd be tokenizing these folks. But these folks can help translate the meaning back from these groups into the context of the recommendations. And so it's really important to have those translating folks, but also not seeing them as spokespeople, as like the elected spokespeople for these different demographic groups. The last thing, just to talk about the philanthropic community. I think what I've broadly heard is that there is a role ultimately, whether it's now or later, and I want to talk about this more, Ms. Fleming, is the philanthropic sector wants to play a role, and they, say if you're looking at the Green Line, the existing Green Line, they played a large role in leveraging dollars both for organizing in the context of community, but also development in itself too. I think the question for them is like, what do we need to do here? Like, what is community asking for? So we were thinking like, well, it's good to have those folks at the table. One, we're looking for foundations who are doing work, whose programmatic interest already is shown a footprint within the Blue Line Extension corridor community, who are interested in anti-displacement and ultimately will find a role back to it. So these folks we're hoping is to structure learnings back to foundations and define areas of opportunity for the philanthropic support of anti-displacement working group recommendations. What I would say is there is sort of a classification in my mind. There's the philanthropic representatives as well as the government representatives, and then there's community representatives. It almost represents sort of two sides. The implementing side of folks, and so that's what I mean, like the government folks, philanthropic entity, and then the folks who are part of this community who are fighting to make sure that this project. And so I think it's important that I recognize that, or we're recognizing that, because what this group ultimately is focusing on is community, right? So we're not trying to, maybe what you're worried about, Ms. Fleming, is that the foundation programmatic interests shape the recommendations themselves. And I'll be very, very, very sensitive to that fact, or even to the fact that governments, are trying to shape the recommendation with their own interests and agendas in themselves. Quite the contrary, we're trying to ensure that communities developed agenda and recommendations are structured back the other way into governments and philanthropy. And so we need to facilitate it as such. I think we want to be clear as such. Hopefully, as we're describing the roles, it indicates that that's the context that these folks will be coming in as well. But we sort of just know that if these groups are just sort of told at the end, they don't have the same level of transparency and accountability ultimately to community recommendation and community-centered interest, if we sort of just leave that for at the end. So we're thinking about this, like how to have that conflict, governments, private interests, including philanthropy, in the context of this project, instead of sort of wrestling at it at just first tables. But that said, Ms. Fleming, please, I want to hear more from you as you. I know
I'll start with the philanthropic and then I'll morph into the government. The philanthropic, I don't think they need to get a vote. They don't get to decide. They need to support what is decided. So they don't get a vote. We can tell them, give them information, keep them updated, don't have a problem with that, but they do not get to vote. So that's the philanthropic folks.
Okay, so, I hear that for sure. Yep. We have a plan for that in mind. I'm going to call you. We're going to talk about that. Yeah, but yes, I hear what you have to say, and for sure that's towards the intention.
And then, I mean, because I don't know the process for making the recommendation, whether or not it's going to be consensus-based, all opinions or whatever, I can only comment from the standpoint of not knowing what that is going to be. But I'm not sure what the government role is going to be in this process. I mean, why do we need interpreters? I can talk to the people who can make decisions. Why do we need them? So the people who are the community members who are on this committee, why do they need a go-between? I don't like interpreters. And we've had a lot of that. I mean, from the standpoint of crime in the neighborhood, we can yell and scream and say, oh my God, 20 people were killed today and we need help. And then when the person who is the interpreter gets back to the elected official, they say, the neighborhood's concerned, there's a rise in crime and they show some concerns. Or if I
Mhm.
say, Commissioner Zelli needs to bring his happy ass to all of your Saturday meetings because we need decision makers. If I tell Sophia that, she's going to go back and say, in the meeting, Catherine Fleming said it might be a good idea for you to come to the Saturday meetings. I don't need an interpreter because that's not what Catherine Fleming said. So
Mhm.
when you're talking
Mhm.
about the government officials and things like that, I don't want their watered down, white laced, let's be civil to whoever we're talking to approach to the elected officials. I'll stop there and let you comment because I got more.
Yeah, I love. Yeah, I hear you. So yeah, the idea of translating back to community is actually the thing that I'm trying to get out of, and maybe it's in a different way. Because yeah, I don't. Nobody again, and when we're talking about these organized, organizations or folks in community, we're not trying to supplant. Like, hey, don't talk anywhere else. Only talk in this context here, right? We're certainly not trying to tell. We're certainly not telling groups that that's the structure by which folks need to exist in for the first thing, right? But the other part of it is, yeah, I guess maybe it's just some part of my experience working for some of these governments, knowing the way that policy making happens, and in sort of that back and forth that sometimes exists behind the scenes, how to as much bring a sense of accountability and transparency around. So perhaps if governments did show up in that way, that does not preclude the group from making the recommendation in the first place, right? What we're hoping to learn from them is not translating, but to get the sort of the technical implementation feedback on the aspect of different recommendation ideas. So, right, so if they say, hey, we want to do rent control, right? It's not asking them whether we should do rent control or not do rent control, or for them to translate that back into the government. Is to know what are the technical aspects that within the recommendation, again, for it to be practically implemented, that are necessary components within that recommendation in order for it to be received as practically implemented, right? And so they might say, well, hey, there's a state preemption law, so part of your recommendation needs to go to the state to address state preemption around rent control, in tandem with a recommendation to any particular city to do rent control. And right, that's just a technical aspect that we will have to learn. Of course, there's going to be other folks, particularly within sort of our team at Kira. It's one of the reasons why we're bringing Housing Justice Center as one of our subcontractors. Right, that's what they do. Write laws, or write. Oftentimes, they do write law and policy for governments that fit within the Minnesota legal framework, as well as the broad understanding, of course, within the context of research and what we know from around the country, what's actually effective and implementable. And that's directed towards community for them to make the recommendation, not to governments to say whether that's something that we should do or not. So
No, that could be
oh, sorry.
that could be a predecessor to the meetings. I mean, you should come to
Sure.
the meetings with the information laid out for folks as to exactly what steps need to be taken if you want rent control. You've already heard recommendations from the community or buzzes here and there. Those should
Mhm.
already be laid out when they get there. So, I mean,
Right.
the person at the state or whatever doesn't need necessarily to be there if we've already laid out what needs to happen. If there are additional questions, then we can engage that person for more legal dialogue or state legislative laws and things like that. So,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
go ahead. I think Jason had to talk. I mean, I've been just going on a tangent here. I'm sorry, Jason. You look like you had something to say.
No, I mean, I have one comment, but I feel like you're on a good roll, so you should let it rip until we should hear from you. I mean, that's great feedback. I think that everyone appreciates hearing. So thank you for sharing it, and appreciate the thoughtful response too, see Terrence. So no, Catherine, keep going, and then I have one thing. If you don't cover it, then I guess I have one thing to share. So
No, go ahead and do that. And I've got some notes here, so I'm gonna look at those
Okay.
for C. Terrence.
Okay. So one question that I had, C. Terrence, is just around, I mean, this is good information and I like the way that it's framed, just trying to get different slices, but of the community to be involved and all of that, I think that makes a lot of sense. My one concern and just what I'm thinking as I hear this is, and just having been involved with this for a while, that you start to see the same people. And my concern would be that we're going to create this new group and it's going to have this input, but that input is already the people that are engaged with the project already. And
Yeah.
I think on some level, it would really, I think it would be more impactful for anti-displacement to have new voices and the people that aren't typically involved in this that represent maybe a larger. So I guess is my question is really just around it looks like you've obviously put thought into who should be involved, but how do you keep it so that it isn't just the same people that we're already engaged with?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And yes, I think that's definitely the intent. I feel pretty aware of the folks and the different folks, particularly in community and governments who have been at this table for a decade, maybe now at this point. And in knowing that a lot of those folks and a lot of those organizations are part of the cohort that Hennepin County Met Council have been convening for the past year or so, right? So some of those folks are in a cohort, and we're thinking about, of course, balancing those folks. Who's in the CAC? Who's in the BAC? I assume some members of both of those groups might apply for this group as well. And we're going to make the decision, why we're going to review the applications, and again, why we want a member from the BAC and the CAC as well together to be able to make a decision knowing the different folks who you guys already see who already might be activated in different spaces. The other thing is, I feel very strongly about, and I think part of the reasons why I think we were selected as the award for this project is Kira has a very, very deep bench of networks throughout this whole corridor, right? Our own organizing program has graduated some 400, 500 organizing graduates. Most of them have, and I think like 200 of them are within this corridor themselves. Most of those folks not being currently activated. Some of those folks are activated in this conversation already, but a lot of them are not. As well as partnering with other organizations who are currently not activated in the space is already part of our sort of media, our messaging, our networking strategy to get folks into this as well. So I feel aware of who those folks already are, and we're tapping into our networks that are in this corridor that are not within the folks who are already players at the table to fill members of the group. But we want you to join us in making that decision making to get different folks in the room that you haven't seen as well. So I think that's important. I agree with that, and it's definitely our intention to get that too. So hold us accountable to that. Actually.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And we see that all the time, Jason. It's always the usual suspects who come to the meeting, stay at the meeting, who are always engaged, which shows a level of dedication, but you only get those voices. And in some instances, I'm one of those voices. So, I mean, I know others who are what I call the usual suspects. We are there, but there's multiple reasons for that. There are people who want to be engaged that I talk to, but their responsibilities don't allow for this type of ongoing engagement. They are passionate about what happens, but they just are unable to do that. So that's why we, who can be available, gather those voices and make that representation if we possibly can for those who are not able to be at the meetings the same way we are. But along
And I very much, and I really appreciate that. I feel like more of, I come from a certain perspective and I am on this committee. I'm already voicing my opinion. We don't need more of my opinion. We need, more people, but I definitely, I mean, Catherine, you are in every meeting and you comment in every meeting, and if we had more Catherines, the world would be a better place, and these projects would be better thought out because your feedback's so valuable. But I feel like it ends up being, it's like I see people like myself all the time in meetings, and I want it to be newer and different voices. So
you too. I would love that.
that's what I meant by that.
Yeah, and we're building this line for the youth. So those are the people who I would love to see more representation. I know Terrence has got that on his list, but definitely a strong focus on bringing in the youth in our community. on all types. And I'm not talking about just the middle class. I'm talking about the kids who may have been in foster care, or the kids who
Yeah.
may have had an instance with the criminal justice system. So what I'm calling regular kids who should have a say, because they are going to be the transit riders, not the ones who are driving their parents' Mercedes. We're talking about the next generation of transit riders. So, see, Terrence, I know you haven't gotten all to the details yet, but are we giving a particular timeline for approval of these recommendations to this group? Because I don't see listing any decision makers, and I know it's terrible for me to say this, but if I need to have something done, I don't spend a lot of time with people who can't make decisions. So I mean, we can talk, but if you can't decide, you're wasting my time.
Right. Yeah, so we're building the group actually. So there, of course, the recommendations need to totally be finished by the end of our 18-month project, which I think we're pointing towards around February 2023 is about where the timeline is. But what we are not saying is that the recommendations have to wait till then. In particular, when we think about what I've heard largely from community is, and you can see sort of the four themes. I think it sounds like y'all have already heard this, but we're gonna have 4 full Saturday meetings instead of month-to-month meetings, because it's just hard to keep folks' attention span to sort of hold that line. So we can really focus in particular on some topics. Like we'll have data and research deep dives. We'll have speakers from community, governments, and private interests to sort of give a sort of a feedback loop into sort of the thinking, and then of course the discussion around policy and investment recommendations. That's what's going to happen at each of those big Saturday meetings, which are spread throughout that time between essentially now and February 2023. You can see the 4 themes. So the first one, learnings from existing blue and green lines on previous blue line extension work, housing and cultural displacement, business displacement, and then finalizing recommendations should be when we get there. But we're having that discussion on policy and investment recommendations in each of those meetings. If the group feels like they are ready to make a recommendation at any point, then they can make a recommendation at any point. We're not holding folks back or holding information back. We know that there are already demands in community that maybe folks who end up in this space align with, and it makes sense, especially as they dive into data or whatever it is. They can make the recommendation at any particular time without waiting to that end goal. So yeah, we want folks who are there to make decisions. Again, we don't want to wax poetic. We don't want to leave this with, we need to study more about this. We're here to make tangible and practical decisions. And whenever the group has the information and the ability to do that, let's do it. So yeah, it could.
I'm sorry. Sophia, were you saying something? I was just going to say that, but people need information. I mean,
Oftentimes too.
while they're sitting in these Saturday meetings, there's development going on. There's a lot of things going on, and people need that information in order to make informed decisions. So are some of these meetings going to be what I call pitch meetings, where developers are going to come and say, listen, I want to develop on 21st Avenue or near Lowry or whatever within the zone of where the blue line is going to go, and I want your support? Or what type of speakers are we talking about?
Yeah, well, it's somewhat, we need to co-design that once we get the group SAT itself. I mean, if that's the interest of the group, then perhaps that could be, the project of this group itself. I'm not precluding that, which again, the first meeting is going to be about solidifying the research agenda, the engagement agenda, and what the group norms and all those different sort of things. So I don't want to precursor that. I suppose that's possible, right? I mean, I don't know if those projects exist right now today, but if they do, then and the group feels like this is a capable space of discussing it, then I think that could be a space. I think recognizing though it may differ from the actual policy making or decision making structure that might need to go on. So say if there's a development, say on Lowry and Penn Avenue, right, it's got to go through its own city processes and for it to be, actually approved or whatever it is, especially if they're looking for subsidies or that sort of thing. So just knowing those technical aspects of decision making. But if the group wants to discuss particular projects,
will they have input into those projects from an anti-displacement perspective? In other words, in your example, if they're building something on Lowry and Penn or wherever,
sure.
And the community says, we don't want an adult bookstore there, and they've already put in their application with the city. Do they have input into those activities is pretty much what I'm asking. First, they have to think about them, and second, would they have any input into those?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not precluding anybody from doing that. To be honest, Miss Fleming, I never thought about this specific thing, but I'm open to it, right? And open for sure for the structure to allow stuff like that happen should the group feel like that's a valuable use or, you know, high use of their time. So I'll just say like they can do that. I don't know if that's what they'll want to do, but if that's what they want to do, then I'm sure we can accommodate that within the context of the structure for sure.
Mhm.
That's a good question. I honestly hadn't thought of that before.
One quick question I just had on these meetings. Obviously, you'll have the cohort in the working group, but will these be closed meetings for them, or will, you know, where you can almost have, or will it be more open where if somebody from the community wanted to come and see, or someone was involved in a business that might be impacted and wanted to see what was being talked about, but maybe not part of that specific cohort? How
Right.
do you envision how that will work?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we've crafted that to the particular detail of what it'll actually be, but we are definitely thinking about these meetings being public. I think open meeting law requires them to be public, and I think, you know, finding a way to make that powerful. So whether it might be the whole meeting or maybe there's a particular part of the meeting where the broader public can come in and hear the data and be part of the discussion on the recommendations and needs. I could definitely envision that that will be an element, I'll admit that it's not like refined to the place like here's the agenda for each of these meetings and this whole G. But yeah, so short answer is yes, they'll be public. We just have to refine it to know exactly which way it'll be public. But that's definitely in mind and part of the intention.
So, see,
Thanks.
Terrence, is your group being provided information about time-sensitive financial uh, possibilities for the blue line extension? In other words, you would be able to tell the group, listen, there's funding available for um, landscaping, but those funds are only available from now until May. So we need to make a decision about that now if you want to, etc. Are you being provided that information from Met Council, the state, Hennepin County, all of the possibilities where we might receive funding, whether it's federal or whatever level?
I think we will. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the clear reasons why, again, I mean, I didn't note that when we were talking about both philanthropic folks and the government structure, but we know that they already have grant programs and funding that centers in this corridor that is relevant to that. Yeah, I would expect that information to be, um, uh, you know, transparent and within the context of this group. And when there's decision making possible within that, then I would expect that this group would take on some of those
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, Catherine, I think that's right. I mean, we'll work close. I mean, we're working. I mean, the anti-displacement working group and the contract is with Hennepin County and Met Council, and so we'll be working closely with C. Terrence and his team all the way through this. And to the extent that obviously this is an important topic, and it's an important topic because of, and it's been put in place because of the project. So the project and the anti-displacement group will work closely together. There's some things that the working group are going to recommend that cannot be tied to the project, and so we'll work with C. Terrence to get those implemented in other ways, and some of them can certainly be tied to the project. And to those things, yes, we'll work to incorporate those into the project scope.
Okay, does that include housing?
So yeah,
Housing is probably not tied to the project, the Blue Line project. It would be part of maybe recommendations that, you know, the anti-displacement group does, and then goes to some of the like the city or the county maybe to implement. That's the like the different parts of the implementers, right?
and so just to add to that, right, those are the folks that we're distinctly thinking about as the government folks, like say in the city, CPED, or some of the Met Council, the HRA, or like the different groups who do not transit-related stuff in particular, the folks that we want to populate those internal government groups. Because yeah, the recommendations are going to go beyond this project, and expecting that in designing the structure to accommodate those types of recommendations. I mean, that's going to be probably the dominant recommendations I would
I'm
expect.
sure. I mean, we don't have to be rocket scientists to realize that one of the primary recommendations is going to be housing when we're talking
Right.
about anti-displacement. And then on the business side, additional commercial space on whatever corridor that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
So,
sure. No, it's totally my expectation. That's exactly right. CPED, the folks at the city who do, business-centered grants and yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah, for sure.
right. I mean, it doesn't have to be grants. I mean, anyway.
Well, okay. Don't get tied to that. I just mean the folks who would receive the recommendation about those types of things will likely fall into those same departments. I'm not precluding or saying that it will be grants or not. Yeah.
Okay. All right, I
And
got
you
you.
know, this is the root of the discussion, right? That Terrence needs to launch, right? It's getting into all of these details, right? We're kind of it's kind of the is the structure that's being put forth conducive to these discussions, and you know, real lot of thought from the Cura team in making sure that there's, you know, really robust conversation and like in-depth conversation with the meeting structure as well as kind of the representation that it was covered. So I don't want folks to think that like every possibility has to be kind of worked out this moment, but just kind of, you know, the overall directions and steps that we're about to kind of to go on with that.
Yeah, but I think the ones we're talking about are going to be key, and what people are going to be concerned with. What's the decision-making process, which C. Terrence said he's working on. Will those recommendations be put into action? Those are going to be important. And then who are the players? Will there be an opportunity for housing, which is almost synonymous with displacement in most community members' minds? And then just pivoting on to the business community who are going to be looking to either maintain or have additional commercial space for their businesses and not to be displaced for whatever reason. So,
Right.
when will you have your process together? Do you know?
Well. So I would say that the process together, meaning that we finalize the process, that will happen in the first two meetings, which will be smaller meetings. Which, if you go to the next slide, it's kind of these big full Saturday meetings, and then there's going to be sort of meetings in preparation for those big Saturday meetings. So yeah, finalizing the group norms and processes will happen with the anti-displacement working group members themselves, right?
Right.
I think it's just
Talking about the decision for the recommendations.
for this you're talking
Yes.
about.
How will the group or you or whomever decide what is a recommendation?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I would imagine that it will be consensus decision making with the group, with obviously focusing on the community members themselves. Yeah. I don't want to say it's like it's gonna be Robert Rules of Order. I mean, a lot of folks reject Robert's Rules of Order
Right. No, I mean,
these days, but
is
it
it
could be that.
one man, one woman vote? Is it consensus? Will
Yeah.
all opinions be brought to management for consideration? Those kind of questions, because it goes back to will the recommendations be implemented? And I'm sure that you've been hearing that all along.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, one person, one vote, consensus decision making amongst the anti-displacement working group members, focusing on the community members themselves as those votes. Yeah, all the recommendations will come with, in my mind, the recommendations will come with the appropriate, like a direction of that recommendation. So is this a recommendation to the city of Minneapolis, a recommendation, like to what interested party to receive that recommendation? Um, Again, I do have to be very clear, right? The decision in this group there is no legal requirement for these recommendations to be adopted by any interested party outside of that, right? That just simply doesn't exist and won't exist as part of the process. But what we will know is if the recommendation goes to Hennepin County, we'll know the person within Hennepin County who will be responsible for moving that recommendation forward, or to whoever that interested party is, right? So we'll identify the actual policy making process behind that. That'll be transparent to obviously the anti-displacement working group members and the public at large. to be able to track the progress of that recommendations to its,
Well,
official
look,
adoption or not.
I appreciate you bringing to bear the comment that there's no legal requirement. Well, guess what? We don't need legal requirements. We can vote your ass out. We can protest and we can do other things. So there are ramifications for that. And I don't want the officials to believe that because there's no legal requirements that they get to do what the heck they want to do, because they won't.
I feel like I could just like, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Some really good discussion, and obviously hearing the importance of that folks are really wanting that the work of this anti-displacement group to be taken seriously by our partners and municipalities, and making sure that recommendations really get traction within those communities. So I'm sure heard loud and clear, and obviously we'll need to, there's a lot of interest in the particulars, so definitely coming back to talk about that and keep you guys in the loop as that group norms and storms and gets everything developed. I think there's some timelines that Terrence wants to share, then we kind of do that quickly and leave the other half of the meeting to kind of get into the draft report, because we do want to have some discussion about that. And as we've been using almost half the meeting already, I have a way of truncating that next discussion so we can have discussion versus just presentation. We'll get into that in a second.
Yeah, right on. Yep. So the nuts and bolts detail, the application will go live next Monday on December 20th, which will be open through January 14th. We're not necessarily closing applications after the January 14th, but we're trying to give folks a deadline to point towards. We'll lead the process at Kira with myself. Dr. Brittany Lewis will be on the interview panel, as well as one of Ned Wickmore and Lee Colshabassary, the two organizers on the staff. And then we're hoping, of course, for one BAC and one CAC members to join the interview process as well. As we get the applications, we'll schedule the interviews and that kind of thing. It'll be a broad campaign for the application, so hopefully y'all see that, both from ourselves, government partners, and others. And then the first meeting and the early meeting, which will be one of the smaller meetings, will be, I would bet, in early February, which will be that orientation, solidifying the research agenda, solidifying group norms and decision-making process, and those sort of things too. So, yep, that's all the big things to say. I think there's been some really good questions, for us to think in more detail about. So I appreciate y'all, and particularly you, Ms. Fleming. I'm going to call you. We'll talk about this more. I'm sure there's more questions. Yeah, what'd you say?
I said I appreciate it. Thank you. We'll talk.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll see y'all soon.
Bye.
Okay, Jason, take it off. Go ahead.
Oh no, that was it. I was just saying.
Cool. Well, I will jump into the draft route modification report. I think what we're going to do tonight, if it's okay with the committee, is that there's 6 goals, and walking through all of 6 goals takes quite a bit of time. So instead, I think what I'm going to do is just kind of get folks grounded in the report itself, kind of what it includes, and give a couple examples of how the goals have been evaluated, and then kind of skip to the end a little bit. So we're not running through all 6, we'll run through like 2, and then leave time for discussion and thoughts and all that kind of stuff, so that we don't just spend the rest of the meeting in the presentation, and that we still have some time to talk and get reactions and all that kind of stuff. Does that sound good to folks? Okay, and we can always skip back to go into specific details somewhere. So this report is the culmination of all of this year of work. It's hard to think about where we were a year ago when this committee first started meeting. One of our first meetings, we didn't have a route yet, right? That was kind of some of the first steps we took of deciding actually where we're going to place the LRT, asking about what are these the right places? Did we miss anything? Adding station study areas, thinking of our graphics, really kind of pulling all those pieces together. Now we're at a place where there's a whole package of what this LRT thing is, where it connects, where it could connect, And that gives us the ability to really take that technical work, take that engagement and feedback that's happened over the past year, and pull together the data to evaluate the routes against project goals. And you all helped shape those goals back in that March timeframe when we first kind of started kicking things off. They were some of our foundational work, and now are going to be reflected to in this report. So, basically there's kind of 3 sections of the report in terms of what we analyze and based on the areas, right? And in Brooklyn Park on the top half, since that part of the project really hasn't changed, we're affirming that, and you'll see that in the slide. In area 2, even though there's only one route option, we still have to show if it meets the goals. We have to still affirm that that is a good choice to make to take LRT there. And then in area 3, Washington and Lowry, we have this choice, or Washington, Lowry, and West Broadway, we have this choice to make about which route to go. And so each of the 6 schools got rated as poor, good, or excellent. And poor meant that they did not meet the goals, where good does mean that they provide a benefit, they serve the community. Community doesn't mean we're not without challenges. But to kind of looking at what those challenges are, or the level of the impacts, that we can find ways to either mitigate or put pathways forward or do things with design to help. And then excellent is where the route has something unique about it that makes it particularly good, that delivers this exemplary positive benefit in some way or another. And so with that, I won't read them all because we're going to kind of go through them, but our goals are the fundamentals of the project as an improved transit access to kind of some of these other community benefit things, like working towards advancing regional equity. We'll skip through Brooklyn Park. I'm going to do goal 1, and I think I'm going to skip down to goal 6. And it's kind of the improved transit. So we have the goal of improving transit access and connecting to jobs and regional destinations. One of the reasons we asked like 5 bazillion times of what these important destinations and places are is that we wanted to make sure that they were captured in what we're analyzing. And so there's various things that inform this goal, right? How do we look at this goal? It's the overall ridership and ability to expand and improve service, especially for folks that don't have cars. That's something that we talked about kind of in the beginning quite a bit. There's also this reverse commute, right? Like residents in Minneapolis connecting to a region, right, and going to places like downtown Robbinsdale or North Hennepin Community College or various places around the line and vice versa. Not having that linkage that connects us all and makes our region more mobile. And then it's the very basics of what kind of transit can do is that access to housing, employment, schools, and amenities that people need that we go to enjoy our lives. Whether that's shopping or seeking healthcare, et cetera. And so when we look at goal 1, and why we're doing goal 1 is that basically you'll see this on every slide, that in this regard, all these routes do really well. And so if we're taking area 2, Robbinsdale in Crystal, our 63rd station and our Bass Lake Road station in Crystal provide similar access and connections to jobs as our previous route did, right? The good reasons that we were doing the project before and had stations there before still hold very, very true. For example, at Bass Lake Road in Crystal, you're really connecting to this commercial hub. You have a lot of residential, and we've heard from residents of Crystal, for example, the need to just have these connections that sometimes feel lacking in the transportation network. In downtown Robbinsdale, you are just like before. We're serving the heart of the downtown, and now we also have this ability to connect to North Memorial Hospital, as well as the grand rounds and the regional parks, kind of at that station. When you come over to Lowry and start to look at that, there's the ability to serve quite a large percentage of people that have limited or no access to personal vehicles, as well as kind of low-income individuals and a very high percentage of residents of color. Again, we're providing those accesses to regional destinations. There's the kind of one of the kind of considerations with Lowry when you compare it to West Broadway a little bit is that the Lowry Washington route is longer. It's close to a mile longer. And because of that, there's a couple more stations and connection points. With that, though, some of these stations, particularly on Washington, have the constraint of both the river and the freeway, and kind of the potential future development, but still things kind of underway in the process. Summary table, real quick, you can kind of see both where all the zero car households are, a lot of jobs, obviously in the North Loop. We're picking up a whole lot of jobs, and then just kind of population spread throughout and serving those kind of demographics that we just touched on. For West Broadway, it's really hitting the cultural and commercial heart of North Minneapolis. A lot of people spend a lot of time on West Broadway. There's major employers like the Minneapolis Public Schools, as well as smaller employers and kind of things in between, as well as things like the Capri and kind of these assets that are part of the community. Like Lowry, you're also serving a lot of folks that don't have personal vehicles, residents of color, etc. Kind of that similar list. Similar summary table as well, picking up some of our major stations and kind of seeing that distribution of where you have the zero car households and various demographics. We go into that analysis as we go through all the various goals of improved frequency and reliability of transit service. I'll kind of just skip through these really quick. Sorry if it gives everybody a little bit of vertigo. I know watching slides flip real quick, all of a sudden it's like, whoa. So kind of try to do it a little slowly. Also kind of getting some of the message out there, but I'm going to skip down to goal 6. Just to kind of, because I think it gives the breadth of the different kind of analysis. Dan, feel free to jump in if you want.
You want me to do it, Sophia? Give your voice a break, and then you can take it from here?
Yep, do goal 6. Yours.
Okay. So, the other goals, there's a lot of goals around transit. There's the goal 4, which is around redevelopment opportunities, and goal 5 is around environmental impacts and climate action and those kind of things. Goal 6 is one that we put in and added for this project tied to our principles to see how any of these routes would work towards advancing the issues of equity and working towards reducing regional racial disparities. And so this comes around and starts to take into effect, how do any of these routes provide opportunities to invest in areas that were either disinvested in or just simply not investments didn't come forth, and certainly not investments that public investments that benefited the community. And how do we also use those opportunities to minimize displacement? So this talks a lot about how and why. When we talked about this goal and we talked about advancing this project, of course, early on, displacement was key, especially displacement of local businesses and residents in these historically underinvested neighborhoods. And so that's part of why we formed the anti-displacement team, and partly why this is one of our goals. Also, a measurement in this goal is how we preserve and enhance these communities, looking at both existing cultural and community assets. Can we make sure those assets stay? Can we build a project that honors them, supports them, and actually builds them up? And then the other part that kind of is in here as well is, as long as we're going to invest in these communities, we don't want the investment to be at the expense of, we don't want the investment to be a positive, but yet at the expense of conditions that make for difficult arrangements to continue. So how do we protect property access? How do we protect parking? How do we protect right-of-way, sidewalk and connections and things like that? So those are all parts of this goal. So when we compare this goal to Area 2 on the next slide, Brooklyn Park, Robbinsdale, and Crystal, we find that, you know, at least off of the surface, building the LRT in an existing Hennepin County transportation facility like County Road 81 helps minimize right-of-way acquisition, helps minimize access impacts, helps minimize impacts to historical and cultural areas along here. Becker Park, downtown, Robbinsdale, and places like that. We don't have to acquire a lot of right-of-way. We can find room within the existing transportation corridor and build this route. Building a route in Area 2 also improves accessibility and connectivity to the broader transit system. So obviously, if we build Blue Line extension, it connects to the Blue Line, it connects to the Green Line, provides opportunities for people to access St. Paul and University of Minnesota, Hopkins, Eden Prairie, areas for jobs down there, Bloomington, and helps us do that and provide that access at all kinds of regional centers and activity centers throughout the region. So it helps do that. But it also furthers regional equity because this is not a metro access is not metro system being BRT and LRT is not something that's currently available in a lot of the environmental justice communities in Brooklyn Park and Crystal. So especially up there, while there is connections to C&D line in Minneapolis, there's not connections to the metro system up in Brooklyn Park. And so this helps provide that. Those cultures are environmental justice communities, a lot of transit dependent riders up there. And so this rating ranks as good in Area 2. Now you can go on to Lowry. So similarly, it has this potential, building an LRT connection up Washington Avenue and across on Lowry does have that potential to support community wealth building. That area has historically had limited investment. Some of the investments that were made to transportation, like the construction of I-94 through here on next to Washington Avenue, would be considered more of a disinvestment than an investment, building a large freeway through the community. This hopefully then has the ability to provide an investment that builds up this area, either both along Washington Avenue and on Lowry. But we're going to have to pay particular attention to parking on Lowry and Washington Avenue, primarily Washington Avenue. A lot of parking takes place there today. We've got to take advantage of that. We've got to make sure that we minimize the impacts and provide the benefits that can come with this route. So while the opportunities aren't as great here, it still scores as good with regard to those evaluation findings. West Broadway, a little bit better in our minds as we look at this. It does provide access with an LRT route to the commercial district.
Dan.
Yes.
He's on a roll, Jason. I was trying to wait for
Catherine
him.
is trying.
Could you go
Okay,
back?
You want to talk specifically about Lowry, Washington? You want to finish West Broadway and come back? What do you want to do?
No, it was Lowry. I was just asking about the parking. I don't know anything about heavy parking on Lowry and Washington other than trucks. So I was just curious about.
Well, so here's what we've learned, Catherine. That's a good question. Here's what we've learned. There is a lot of truck parking there. That's true. We're understanding that a lot of that truck parking there is from people that potentially live on the other side of 94 and have that as a job and don't really have a spot. They're independent truckers. They may not have a spot, a home base, if you will. And so they certainly can't, have room in their site. So they're using that today. So not necessarily that it has to be preserved on Washington, but how are we going to deal with this? Should we have a spot if that parking goes away? should we have a spot that becomes an available area? How do we mitigate that? That's what, Sophia, isn't that something that we've learned there? That's what I believe to be the case.
I thought the city was dealing with that.
They took some actions. I'm not exactly sure where they ended up with that.
Okay.
I know they had some stuff on there. They had some ordinance requirements on their agenda. They don't love the parking there, but just getting rid of it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It may just move it.
Right. No, I understand, but I thought that was under their purview. And then talking about Lowry, there's a number of areas where you can't park already on Lowry. So
You're right, Catherine. There's certainly more spots along Lowry that are already no parking than parking.
okay,
That's true.
So, Dan, just really quick to follow up on that parking question for Washington Avenue. So, when you refer to the fact that you're going to have to handle parking, are you talking about those trucks? Or are you saying there's other parking that's happening on Washington that's like core to the, or what does that refer to?
I mean,
that there are people parking there?
primarily it's two things. It is, I mean, what we found in the parking analysis that we did, that Washington Avenue, where parking was available today, was almost always full. Okay. So it was highly utilized. Part of that is the trucks. Part of that is the semi-tractor trailers that are there. And if they're still there, and I don't know where Minneapolis is going to go with this, but if they're still there and we have to deal with mitigation for that by removing that parking, it's a topic that we have to deal with. The businesses along there also use the street. I mean, a lot of them have off-street parking, but maybe not enough. And so there's a lot of parking there as well. So that'll also be part of what we have to at least identify and mitigate for as we would take that away.
So Jason,
because that really becomes the main, unlike on West Broadway, where traffic impacts are likely to take away a travel lane and some parking because the road is much narrower. Up here, we can leave pretty much most of the lanes in, the number of lanes in place if we remove the parking. So that'll be a piece of it. And maybe the city will say, maybe an answer will be leave the parking, but take another travel lane away. And how does that affect traffic? Those kind of mitigations will be at play.
Yeah, I was just saying that for the most part, it's truck parking, sprinkles of cars on Washington. So I don't know what their study was.
Yeah, no, I mean, I drive on Washington there from Lowry all the time, and it definitely is a lot of semis. And so I just was curious if, I mean, you're just saying available parking, and it is always full because there's always semis there, but that's not all of the parking. But you're not specifically referring to like one issue over another. You're just saying that when you look at parking along that corridor, it's usually filled because those trucks are always there. There's also some cars, whatever.
And Jason, Catherine's also right. If the city, for some reason, says, listen, there's not going to be overnight parking for trucking on anywhere in the Minneapolis city limits, including along Washington Avenue, then that issue gets minimized for us. But does it? I mean, those trucks are going to go somewhere. People don't park just because they feel like, hey, that sounds like a good spot. I mean, they park because they have a need to. And so...
Right, the city backtracked a little bit because the majority of those truckers are minority, and this is their source of income, so they didn't want to have such a negative impact on them, although there's been many, many complaints about the semis parking there longer than what the city current rules allow for.
Sure.
So that's...
No, it's a tough one. That's a tough issue. It is definitely a tough issue.
And it's a really good example about how we work in partnership with our partners for a lot of what we're doing here. The anti-displacement work, a lot of the success in that is working with our partners. Some of the issues some things, you can really just handle very nicely within the context of a project. But realizing a lot of these things, we don't, Met Council and Hennepin County either organization doesn't do it in isolation. We definitely have to work with the cities. It's a kind of a collective effort to get this all right and to do the best it can. So it's just examples of that needed partnership and collaboration as we move forward.
And part of this becomes, and why it becomes an equity issue is, I mean, we're not proposing We're not proposing LRT on Washington Avenue so that we can get rid of semi-truck parking, right? I mean, that's why we're proposing it. But at the same time, that could be a resultant thing that happens. So we've got to be able to understand how we're going to deal with it and how we're going to deal with it equitably.
Right, it's unintended consequences sometimes.
Exactly.
That's where the community comes in, because we can let you know those truckers are minority, they're trying to have a business, etc.
Yeah, and a perfect example of good, community engagement. Like, you might have heard that same thing from city staff in discussion, right? Because they are aware, but it was often community members pointing that kind of stuff out to us to say, hey, make sure that this is part of your analysis, or this is an important topic to us, and consider it. So yeah, exactly. Anyways, Dan, there you go. Last slide, or not last slide, but.
So as we go to West Broadway, we find from an equity standpoint, this does a couple of things. It provides access to the commercial district on West Broadway, which is highly valued by the community. This is the heart and soul of North Minneapolis, as we've heard from many folks, the West Broadway business corridor. And so we're bringing a transportation investment there that helps serve that. It does have the potential to support community wealth building in an area that has historically had limited investment, and in some cases worse than limited investment. As you can see from the map, this is the area, the red being the area where it was potentially by 1934 homeowners appraisal status hazardous to provide loans, and the yellow being definitely declining areas to provide loans for home ownership. And so in regard to that, how can bringing a new transportation investment here and working with the community help to reverse some of the less than fair and equitable practices that were done here in the past, and how can we help build up this community? At the same time, while that may be a positive, how do we also minimize the negative? And so that's why along here, both in the bubble at West Broadway and Penn, and the bubble along West Broadway between Lyndale and Irving, we've got numerous design options, because we really want to help provide the best and put the LRT in the spot to help stimulate the best amount of growth in the north side without doing the most damage. And so maybe a split with 21st is better than everything on West Broadway. Maybe we eliminate some turn lanes at Penn or change where we put the station in order to make that work. And we've got options on all of those areas. So in the area of disparity reduction and equity, certainly as a project team, we believe that using the West Broadway route would rate as excellent in terms of doing that. But it's got to be done right. It can't just, we'll stick LRT in there and it'll be excellent. It's got to be done correctly, and it's got to minimize those overall impacts. That's part of what we hope the project to do. So that's how we see goals.
Can we go back one second? Because I just can I. So one thing that I'm noticing on here is that there is, so either of those options, Lowry or West Broadway, fall into that significant red area. I mean, there's two large chunks of both routes. And I would say that there is the comment about, historical lack of investment or disinvestment in a community. And I would say that if I think about West Broadway and what's been invested recently on West Broadway, it's received way more investment than what's along Lowry. And some of that is just the corridor. But I look at like Minneapolis Public Schools and that large building. There have been other investments that have been made on West Broadway of, with significant amount of dollars that Lowry never received, that they never had access to. And so I'm wondering if, I mean, some of this is subjective, I think, and I don't know if that could be a positive or a negative, but I think if we're looking at it from that viewpoint, there is a lack of investment on Lowry that needs to be addressed relative to the amount of investment. I mean, there is no major public investment like what they did with the Minneapolis Public Schools headquarters on Lowry. There's nothing that's even close to that.
Yeah, the only one I can think of that gets kind of close, Jason, and not fully that far is Hennepin County did completely reconstruct the library there
Yes,
along
yeah, there's been
Lowry.
it. Well,
So
they
that was a
renovated
piece.
it.
They renovated it, right? So that was a piece, but the difference is, I mean, some of this is you're right. There's very much subjectivity in here. This is a lot of these is not based directly on exact numbers. I think some of it becomes the reason why, from a long range standpoint, is there are certainly more commercial and retail vacancies along West Broadway than there are along Lowry, because Lowry is much more heavily residential. And so the goal isn't to remove the residential, but so there's definitely a mix in there, right? And so,
But there are commercial. I mean, there are definitely commercial uh, uh, clusters along
nodes, I think of
Lowry.
them as commercial nodes, right? Yeah. And
Yeah,
as a
nodes,
Often
sure,
where
sure.
the stations are fairly placed, right? Is that
right.
the commercial
Right.
nodes on Lowry are at Penn, and then you have commercial nodes a little bit at Emerson Fremont, or as you kind of go down
Well,
towards the river. So
They're very
so
small.
And
some of
maybe
this,
that means
Jason,
that Lowry can also, and maybe that means that Lowry can also be excellent and not good relative to the West Broadway excellent for this criteria. And I just
understand.
am wondering because there is, I mean, it's like if Lowry and West Broadway had the same level of investment, then I could see that, then it's a little bit of a different conversation. But there has been a much lower level of investment on Lowry than there has been on, and then that just is like one of the
Sure.
criteria. So I feel like that needs to be
Right.
fairly represented.
Well, and that's a great. So what you're just saying there, Jason, everything you just said there is exactly the reason why it's beneficial we wanted to do a draft report that laid out the thinking as we saw it from public feedback and work to date, and then to take that kind of feedback. That's exactly the kind of feedback that that helps take us from a draft report to a final report. Some people may say none of these should be excellent. They should just be good. Maybe Lowry should be excellent in this category as well. And so those are great. That's exactly the kind of feedback we want to get, because this isn't like, it's not like, okay, if you score from 10 to 7, you're excellent. 7 to 4, you're good. 4 to 0, you're poor, right? There's no quantitative numbers on a lot of these topics.
Right.
And so it really becomes about people's thoughts and feedback. And that's the kind of thing we want to hear.
And then, I mean, Lowry impacts the residents or residential area more profoundly, whereas it's mostly kind of mom and pop kind of businesses on Lowry. But you have to take into account that the opportunity zone, the promise zone, a lot of them stop at the south side of Lowry. So, I mean, there's only some amount of investment that was available to people, even if they wanted to do something there. And along the lines of what Dan said, there's only a certain amount of limited space there on Lowry as well. Doesn't eliminate them, but just factors that we have to include there.
So
And
some of that might come from zoning, some of it might come from what we want to do. But again, maybe it spurs the opportunity for more to happen if an LRT line gets built there. So there's definitely a mix in there. So Sophia, I'm going to let you take the summary.
Sounds good, Dan. And as you can kind of see by going through those two examples, you're starting to pull together data and present it in a way, right? So our job is to deliver kind of the facts as we understand them, see if there's anything missing in part of that discussion. And I think one of the messages from this table is that all three options, even though one's in one section, the two are in the others, are good routes, and can be very beneficial to the community. And this report just starts to lay out some of what those pieces are, to help us kind of move forward in the process. And would like, want to get a lot of comments during this period. Kind of getting into that information is super important. So in January, we have a series of in-person, in big spaces, so that we can stay fairly socially distanced. All the places that we booked are quite large. So even if you have 20 to, whether 20 people or 100 people, right, you can be distanced, as well as some virtual meetings. We also just want to check in with stakeholder groups through this time. Kind of overall schedule for the draft report is that we released it on Monday. There's 45 days minus a bunch of holidays, which gets us to about January 25th. We're going to take all this feedback and things that people ask about and wonder about and whatnot, and pull that into a final report that has a recommendation. Because the final report is the first place that has that recommendation, there's a 30-day comment period with that, and then we would basically have our community supported route, and work towards beginning kind of that next level of analysis, which would be our environmental work, as well as getting deeper into the engineering and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of a fast version of it. We can definitely go back and.
Mama, this is me, Mr. Grumpy.
Thanks, bud. I'm talking right now. Mr. Grumpy, something about Mr. Grumpy. That was I don't know if you picked up on the microphone, but anyways, it's your discussion to have if we want to go back to the summary table or anyway, or there's any other pieces that folks want to kind of dive into. I think we found in some of the other groups that we've been meeting with to just kind of let the floor be open for some of the things that folks are bringing up. When you start to see these goals laid out in these ratings, like what are you thinking about? What are you do you have a preference? Why? Starting to kind of reflect that, because this is the time. And I know I've heard a lot of Kathy's also on the line, and Ellis is. So to the extent that others want to kind of jump into the conversation and add. Oh, my computer wants to kick me out. Add voices. This is definitely Jason. The floor is the committee's.
Well, I think before we get the conversation started, just that list of dates, if we could get something that was like in a document that could be shared on social media. I know you'll have like the individual meetings on the Blue Line Extension Facebook page if you don't already, but to be able to share those with the community, I think would be really helpful. So if we get something that like has that as a way we can share that out, I just want to make sure people have the ability to like get that feedback, go to those meetings, and just know about them in advance. It's crazy to think that that's like less than a month away in January. I mean, we're like a couple weeks out.
We have flyers made per community. So I can when I follow up with the CAC to ask if anybody's interested in helping see Terrence review applications, we can also attach. There are 4 of them so that we can hang them places, kind of per community. But so we'll get all 4 out to everybody to kind of share those.
So Sophia.
So yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
No, it's different than what you're talking about. So let's finish that thought.
No, that's it. I was just gonna tell, like, let's have the discussion was my next thing.
So Sophia, I know that Tim Baylor has asked for direct contact with the city of Minneapolis. Where do we stand with that?
I believe, well, I can't speak for city staff of whether they've have connections, but I think.
Hi, Sophia. This is Jim.
Do you want to jump in there?
Hi, Catherine.
Hey, Jim, I knew you were the one they were gonna pick. I'm so happy. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Good. Um, I have contacted Tim and I contacted West Broadway Area Coalition, and they, as you know, they are in some transition right now. Tim got back to me and said that he was going to get together a group of people and contact us. He thought potentially it would have to be after the holidays. But so we have made contact and we're willing to talk with you or anybody about our involvement in it. But we're here. We're sitting here in the meeting. I could even talk about the truck parking ordinance if you want, but I didn't want to break up their flow. So yeah.
I'm glad you're gonna be back involved, Jim. This is great news. And Tim did send me the email. That's how I knew about this, but I wasn't sure if there had been a meeting scheduled already. So
I guess I'm waiting on Tim. So because that's what he told me to do. But if people are waiting on me, we'll arrange something.
okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Jason,
Yeah.
what, I like to be transparent. Were you
I'm
aware
just
of
wondering.
the meeting?
No.
I just want to be transparent. The the folks on the back want a direct connection with the city of Minneapolis. They thought that was lacking, and there's a number of reasons for that I won't go into now, but just a heads up that they want that direct connection to the city of Minneapolis.
And is that specifically to the parking on Washington, or is that like just the blue line through
No,
Minneapolis?
no, just definitely not specific to the parking. It's general.
Okay.
Mhm.
So with the number, I mean, we don't have a lot of people on this call. So do we have any feedback that's out there? I mean, I can, well, let me just ask, is there anybody that wants to share feedback based on what we've looked through so far and just what we've looked at? Or, I mean, if you've looked at the draft report, do we have any feedback thus far?
Yes, so we're starting to receive comments and have started to have some kind of stakeholder conversations as well with folks. And I think it's still a little early to really report on a lot of like the summation of some of that. Just you know getting the wheelhouse going. I mean, I think I've heard a lot of things about what folks want to see in terms of the final report, and we'll just kind of continue to build off that. But it's really the space where you're trying to get people's initial thoughts and reactions. So we'll be able to when we get back in February. The goal of our February meeting will be just to talk about what we've heard during this 45-day comment period.
So Sophia,
I'm also,
I'm sorry, Jason.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, are these comments incorporated or different than the ones on the maps that I've been looking at when we go to the website?
So the there's the interactive map is a way to give comments. Comments can also, we have a comment form live right now on the website, as well as inviting people to just email me comments. Like, for example, if an organization is taking a position, they might have like a PDF or supporting materials that they want to provide. And so just having an email is sometimes the best way to do that. So comments on the interactive map are still welcome. Comment forms, the report itself, we're anticipating that some folks might just be out in community and need paper, whether it's our staff ourselves or some of the community cohort that we're working with, or just even at the public events, people might want to take a comment form. So we have a mail back form, and then email.
So is it different? I mean, is that a yes or no? The comments that they're making on this report are outside of all of the other comments on other platforms?
So I think maybe the way to think about it is that any comments that we received, prior to the release of the report, we try to summarize and kind of bring into this report. And now with this new information, no matter the method in which it comes in, if it is on the report, we're compiling it and pulling it together. And there's themes that we've heard throughout the process, and so it's not like we're like, oh, that happened in the past, we ignore that, right? We're trying to build upon that work. I do have some slides, and maybe this is the way to do it, to talk about what we heard in November. So I'll just kind of jump into that real quick. Maybe that'll be a little bit helpful. So we kind of we're in Crystal in kind of late September. We're in Robbinsdale in October. A lot of our November was in Minneapolis. But hearing things overall, and kind of since the March timeframe, we've had a lot of contact with various people, and in particular, over this past year, we've had about 270 events reaching over 9,000 individuals. So, that's when you're at a place and you're talking to folks, talking to a lot of folks, as well as just comments on the interactive map, responses to surveys, comment form comments and whatnot. So that's just a little bit of a summation. To go specifically into things, there's few things that we've heard kind of throughout the corridor very consistently, and some of that is I like to call it the comments that refer to making decisions with the lens of fairness. So fairness to the community, fairness of impacts, fairness of a whole bunch of things. The minimizing of property impacts, especially to kind of pinnacle properties, safety, and pedestrian safety and station safety and all that kind of stuff, as well as support for businesses during construction. Comes up a lot in the Minneapolis context, but it's also something that we've heard in Robbinsdale, it's something that we've heard in Crystal, and it's something that we've heard in Brooklyn Park. So, the project team, obviously see Terrence's group might talk a lot about what business support during construction is, but I think that is an item in particular that the project team has identified. We're going to have a robust construction support program for businesses. It's just figuring out what that exactly looks like. We did a whole bunch of door knocking. Themes that emerged were around public safety, station spacing, station area safety, pedestrian access, kind of walking the roads and crossing the streets. Obviously the impacts during construction. We heard a lot from small businesses, that if there's all this investment coming, how do they actually benefit from it? How are those things leveraged? Instead of like some of the small businesses are doing quite well, but that doesn't mean that they have a lot of access to big dollars to renovate a building or have their own building or do something like that. There's less site-specific needs that we heard when we're door knocking. We've done a whole bunch of stakeholder check-ins, and one of the kind of the big pieces of that is we did hear actually a lot of support for West Broadway, in terms of meeting, kind of the potential to foster business and have economic development opportunities if done right. Really wanted to reflect too that we spent a lot of time talking to potentially impacted property owners, and there's the people's needs are different. Some really do not want to have an impact, right? Seeing an impact on their building or home or whatever is very difficult. Where others maybe want to see something different with the property that they have, or are looking for something that a tenant that's something that better suits their needs. So a lot of the success that we have and what we go forward is thinking a lot of these specific solutions as we move forward. In some of our November conversations, when we didn't have the draft report yet, but we were talking about kind of the layouts and things like that. We heard a lot about incorporating the lessons learned from Green and Blue Line in terms of, you know, just kind of the gamut of things, what happened before, during, and after. You know, kind of the traffic impacts and lanes and what that means. And then when we talked about some of the routes themselves, people often express the preference for Lowry, kind of in the sense that they think it might have fewer direct impacts, and then just kind of it is more residential. It hasn't got as much kind of almost what Jason said. It hasn't maybe got as much focus. Like what is this future potential? Whereas when we talk about West Broadway, it's kind of what's there now, how to support it, how to make it, how to get more of it, and that kind of commercial heart of the city itself, of the area. That's kind of my piece on that. So maybe to some extent that responded to the question and what was being brought up. You know, I think I really want to emphasize that right now we're at a place that we want to hear officially from folks. You know, especially like when you know, you kind of have a sidebar conversation, or you have a conversation with an individual, and this is the time to really to have that impact on that final recommendation. And so to the extent that you have individual thoughts, that we want to hear them.
So one thing I can speak to really quickly is just around, we're in this space now where the draft report has been released, it's out in the world, and you're wanting official feedback that, from my perspective, I feel like has been lacking. I know we've talked about this before, but just more of an official communication campaign that gets the word out, which I know we've done lots of driveway talks, and there's been door knocking and some, you know, like leaflet materials or whatever here and there, and there's obviously been a lot of meetings, but there hasn't been like one large coordinated communication campaign that this project is happening and coming. And I think, like, I know that we've looked towards this draft report as sort of the point for that, and I'm wondering, like, is that moving forward? Where are we at in that process? And if it's not there yet, like, when will that be decided? Because I feel like that's a key piece. There's just, from my perspective, as much work as we've done, and we've touched a lot of people, and there's a lot of people that know about this because of the work that's been done, there's so many people that are going to be impacted by this that don't even know that it's happening.
Well, we committed every resident along the corridor is going to be receiving a postcard. And
every resident in Robbinsdale will be notified that this report is available, that it impacts a decision about building LRT along and, you know, in this corridor in Robbinsdale, and has an opportunity to see it. Many of those postcards will go right into the garbage. I get that. I don't care. This doesn't matter to me. To the extent that they can at least know there's something out there, I mean, we'll do what we can.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't expect that there's going to be a checklist that says, like, we talked to this address, we confirmed that they are aware.
Right.
But it sounds like there is a mailer, and so that's amazing. So those are the kinds of things that I want to make sure are happening. So it sounds like in the near, like, is that happening in the next couple of weeks? When does that happen?
Postcards are at the print house right now. We wanted since the events themselves are in January, we didn't want them to go out to the 13th, so then everybody forgets about it. So they're timed to kind of come out, you know, kind of around the holidays. People are home. You might actually look at your mail type thing. So they'll go into production late this week, early next week, and start kind of arriving on people's doorsteps. Not in the far future. We're also spending money on both boosted social media as well as advertisements and various media sources. So to kind of what you're talking about, and our both Kyle and Trevor, who are communications folks, you know, reaching out to like the Suns and the CCX medias and the etc. To both
Great.
let them know about the events. You know, so we've our past round of engagement. We saw some of our reporters kind of come out and cover the discussions that were being had, and so, you know, the engagement team is focused on connecting with a lot of stakeholders and individuals, and our comms team is really focused on a lot of that broad messaging, and getting the reach out as far as possible. So some of that will also be coupled with that we'll do some press work with the Anti-Displacement group. So in a sense, there will be kind of this kind of collective effort to just talk about the project and have that information out in the world. It kind of will amplify and kind of coexist together. So if you're not engaging, hopefully not because you haven't heard, right? It's a lot is going towards getting the word out.
So, Sophia,
That's
who
great.
are
No,
these
that's exactly what I
postcards-
wanted to hear.
Who are these postcards going to?
So, you know, if you look at we talked a little bit about Robbinsdale in the Minneapolis area. It's basically the entire donut around West Broadway and Lowry, as well as the whole middle of that donut. So
I'm talking about property owners who don't live in the state. I mean, if you're only sending to residents, I know it seems like most of your communication is focused on the people who are around the blue line, which is great, but there are going to be other peripheral people, and I don't want to say peripheral because they are key, who are going to be a part of this process. What's being done to communicate to them?
So, Catherine, you're talking about, for example, um, a, a property that is owned by an individual that does not reside at the address and could be out of state.
Yes, that's one. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so we in some of our even the last round of engagement when we sent letters to property owners, we sent letters so it, you know, to both the taxpayer, so the owner of the property, as well as the tenant address. So both were receiving communications where, you know, you want to reach both groups. So that is part of our efforts.
So yeah, I mean, this has been a pretty standard practice for us in the project office since the early parts of the days that we want owners, even if they are, you know, non-residential or not, you know, don't live there, owners of anything from a single family home to an apartment complex, to understand what's going on. But we also want all of the folks who live there at any of those properties to also understand what's there as well. So both the mailings end up going to the tax owners, parts like Sophia said, but then also the individual addresses that are there as well.
And a comment in chat with a dead mic from Alice, but just kind of talking about how much there's to digest and whatnot.
No question. Lots of stuff, lots of info, and we hope that our planning or our CAC members that aren't even here tonight have a copy of the report, that give the report a read, and that as we talk in January or February, I think we're meeting in February next, Sophia, is that right?
Yeah, maybe that's the next good segue, Dan, is our next meeting is scheduled for January 5th. We recommend canceling, partly because we'll just be in the middle of two processes and it'll be right after the holidays, and just give folks a breather. We'll reconvene in February at our normal meeting time to kind of to really focus on what was heard during this process, as well as get some updates from Terrence.
That's going to be my next question, Sophia. When we do reconvene, what are we going to be talking about? This report, or I thought I heard you say we're moving on to the environment and engineering portion of the project?
So that'll come later, Catherine. You know, we're anticipating a final report in the springtime, and so kind of get through this, and then there'll be a recommendation, kind of that 30-day comment period with that, and then moving forward, when we move forward with the route, that's when we would begin our additional engineering and environmental work. So you're getting to late spring, summer 2022 to really begin the digging into the environmental and furthering design work.
Will an architect be joining our team at that point?
Yeah, depends on the topic. We have a lot more to do. So just like in the past, that'll also be a natural transition point where we'll ask for reappointments, to the various committees based on folks'
Catherine,
interest.
do you mean to the project team?
Yeah, to the project team.
Yeah, we will. We will. As we start to move into there, we'll have either folks in-house or from our consulting team that will have architectural backgrounds as we start to look at stations, as we start to look at those other impacts. Yeah, those other design.
I drove to St. Paul the other day, and it's so ugly along University. I don't want to see that
The
happen.
city? Not the whole city.
No, not the whole city, but University, where the train is. It's
That hurts Dan's feelings.
I'm sorry, Dan. Truth hurts. But anyway,
The stations are ugly, Catherine?
the whole thing is industrial looking. I mean, we're not taking into account all of the modern possibilities, the environmental impact, the materials that we're going to use.
Well,
All of
I
those
tell you, we
things.
are going to take, because of the county and the state's climate action plan, we're going to take a lot of a lot of climate action things into consideration in our stations moving forward. We will be.
And are you going to be hiring an ADOS or BIPOC architect?
Well, certainly
Sophia
we will
hesitated in
push
saying yes, of course.
Well, yes, of course we will.
Okay, great. This is being recorded. I'm glad.
I mean, that is certainly, we will certainly obviously set our DBE goals very robustly, and we will have hopefully some really good people. We definitely want the project team and the project consulting team to be highly represented in all of the
We will at
parts
a
of the quarter.
future meeting get more into those details. Right now we actually got to get to a route, and then we can start actually designing it in more detail. So
we're excited to get to those pieces, Catherine. No
Yeah.
question about it.
yeah,
Catherine, I just gotta say, not that you don't always ask great questions, but I feel like when the hat goes on, the gloves come off. Like, wow, letting us have it this week.
Catherine has already been through all of this, right? I mean, we already worked on a design. She's been on the CAC to get us all the way down the design. Now we're going backwards, but we're going to do this again, and we're going to do it as good or better than we did last time.
Yeah, Dan's been around politics or politicians way too long with his answers, so I know where he's coming from here.
I've been
I appreciate that. Keeping everybody
forever, Catherine. Exactly.
Okay, folks. Well, I think there's some follow-up to happen with the committee getting the flyer out and trying to get a representative to help see Terrence in the application process. We'll see some communication from me to just kind of cancel the January and confirm a February time to connect. And since we're basically at time, maybe look to the chair for ready to adjourn, or if there's anything else.
Sophia, we should definitely thank Catherine and Jason and Ellis and Kathy Frazier for all being here tonight and giving their time. We do this all the time. It's not a big deal. You guys are giving extra time, and so I really want to thank you for being part of this and for continuing to engage. And we're happy to have you.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think I mean I'm fine with skipping the January meeting and going to February, and also that we're at time, so adjourning this meeting. But first, I want to say thanks everyone for being here and the great questions and the attention, and also just be safe tonight. It's going to be kind of crazy,
Yeah.
and have a happy holiday season, and we'll see everyone in
February.
2022.
Yes, if I don't see any of you, have a great holiday. And we got a lot to do in 2022, so we'll keep that alive.
That'll be our tagline. We've got a lot to do in 2022. All right.
Thanks,
Happy
everybody.
holidays. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.
Thank you
Yeah,
all.
thank you.
Mhm.